We move now to what I expect will be a fascinating perspective on the federal coalition, which is precisely the view from opposition. The Honourable Joel Fitzgibbon has served as a Labor member of the House of Representatives since 1996, representing the seat of Hunter. He's had senior ministerial experience, including serving as Minister for Defence in the Rudd government, and he was Chief Government Whip in the House in the Gillard government. He's been much in the news of late, partly because of his golfing handicap, but chiefly because he recently resigned his shadow ministerial position and promoted his alternative views about the Labor Party's policies, especially as they relate to climate change and their connections to Labor's traditional working class base. Joel Fitzgibbon brings an up-close look at countering the coalition from the other side of the benches, and we thank him for being with us today. Mr. Fitzgibbon, great to see you. The screen is yours.
Thanks, David, and happy anniversary to all of us who were elected 25 years ago today. That includes John Howard's election to Prime Minister, of course, but also my own election and Anthony Albanese's election to the House of Representatives. And can I say there is great utility in reflecting on and indeed celebrating the legacy of long-term governments. And the Howard government certainly enjoyed longevity. But the real value in such revision is the opportunity it affords us to learn both from the conquests and the failures of the government of that period. And when Andrew invited me to present today, I accepted without hesitation, having first been elected on March 2, 1996. So I watched all the Howard years up close. For me, of course, it was a very long 11 and a half years to November 2007. But I learned plenty from the experience, and I'm sure the Labor Party can still learn from the experience too. Today, I decided to share with you 10 key lessons we can all learn from the Howard years. Now, I've not consistently kept detailed diaries over the course of my 25 years in the Parliament. So I thought it would be useful and helpful to turn to John Howard's own record of the period as a memory refresh and to critically analyse his own account of his long reign. Lazarus Rising is a very long read, but it's an excellent read, and I can recommend it to anyone who has not had the pleasure. John Howard obviously is an intelligent and wily politician. He was also at times a lucky politician. But in politics, as in sport, you do, of course, make your own luck. Or more importantly, good politicians fully exploit every fortuitous opportunity that comes along. And John Howard was very good at doing so. He was probably also deserving of a bit of luck because he didn't have too much of it while in opposition during the 1980s. The 1987 Joe for PM campaign is but one example, and one which is relevant to our discussion today. Which takes me to one of the themes of your conference, the coalition. John Howard was fortunate to have in Tim Fischer, John Anderson and Mark Vaile solid and loyal National Party leaders. Each of them in turn led a relatively united and stable Nationals party room. Certainly when compared with the group Michael McCormack now leads. Nothing could test coalition cohesion and unity like gun law reform did in 1996. But the Nats stuck solidly with the then Prime Minister throughout what was a very, very difficult period for both John Howard and his government. In a rare outcome, the Liberal Party could have governed, of course, after the 1996 election without an arrangement with the National Party. But John Howard was shrewd enough to know he'd need them at some point in the future. And the decision to maintain the coalition arrangement after the 1996 election turned out to be a very wise one. He later learned that he would need them sooner than he might have imagined. That's lesson one. To be a successful party of government in a two-party system, you must build a broad coalition of community support. Critical to achieving that broad support base is accommodating the diverse range, thoughts and attitudes held by the representatives of the many key diverse electorates. In John Howard's case, that meant an ongoing commitment to the coalition arrangement, which has served the two parties so well for such a long time. For the Labor Party, it must mean the policy accommodation of those representing or hoping to represent both our resource-rich regions and the typically progressive suburbs of our capital cities. Building a broad range of electoral support is more challenging for the Labor Party, I would argue, than it is for the coalition parties, themselves two very different creatures. The coalition arrangement allows the National Party or National Party candidates to say much different things in faraway regional seats than the Liberal leader might be saying in our capital cities. I describe it as a form of constitutionally sanctioned cheating. More scandalous, though, is the secretive nature of the so-called coalition agreement, which I think you've spoken about today, which allows the two parties to form a government despite Labor's superior numbers in the House of Representatives. It's easy to think of John Howard's period or his government as one which was pretty much invincible for most of its lifetime. But of course, that was far from the reality. For several long periods, Labor's years in the wilderness looked like they might be somewhat shorter. The fact that it wasn't such an invincible government is testimony to John Howard's shrewd political judgment and political skill. I'll make passing comment here. Scott Morrison has learnt much from John Howard. But Prime Minister Howard was almost a oncer, that's the reality. He lost both the popular and two-party preferred vote at his first attempt at re-election in 1998. In fact, I believe that if it had not been for Labor's ill-conceived promised changes to capital gains tax arrangements, and to a lesser extent, its proposed four-wheel drive tax, Kim Beazley would have been Australia's 25th Prime Minister. Gun laws, the emergence of One Nation, and a courageous promise to introduce a GST had all taken their toll on the then young government. Fast forward to 2001. Of the 17 news polls to August 26, 2001, 15 gave Kim Beazley a comfortable lead, including a favourable 56-44 two-party preferred split in May of that year. But then, of course, came along the MV Tampa, which single-handedly took 8 points of Labor's two-party preferred vote in one fell swoop. The election of Mark Latham as leader in 2004 offered new and unexpected challenges for John Howard. In the early period of Latham's leadership, John Howard struggled. Latham was young, fresh, energetic and smart. He carried little baggage and was unpredictable. He wrong-footed the Prime Minister on several occasions. I recall the United States Free Trade Agreement and its potential impact on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme as an example, which remains vividly with me. 6 months on from Latham's elevation, Labor led the coalition in news poll 54-46. There were 24 news polls between Mark Latham's election and polling day of 2004. Labor led or shared the lead for 20 of them. And the 3 or 4 of the 4 in which Labor did lag occurred in December 2003, which of course was immediately after his elevation to the leadership. The two-party preferred vote, history now tells us on polling day, was 52.7% to the coalition and 47.3% to Labor. Labor suffered a devastating 5-seat loss and its Senate result was a shocker, and there's more to that history as well. It's amazing how much impact a walk through an old-growth forest with Dr. Bob Brown and possibly a bad handshake can have on an election outcome. That's lesson 2. In a 2-horse race, each of the jockeys is a chance all the way to the finish line. You never give up. And lesson 3 is never underestimate your opponent. This is a particularly important lesson for the Labor Party, which is too often prone to doing just that. Indeed, amongst some in the Labor Party, I would argue, an unhealthy belief in our intellectual and moral superiority has led to a form of institutional elitism. Yet, we keep losing elections. No one would now argue that the broadening of the tax base through the introduction of a tax on the growing services sector was a mistake. But back then, despite Paul Keating's 1983 flirtation with a consumption tax, no one was surprised Labor in opposition opposed the government's proposed tax package in the lead up to the 1998 election. But what was surprising to many was Labor's decision to oppose the GST legislation following John Howard's 1998 election victory. In doing so, we chose to ignore the re-elected government's mandate and sidelined ourselves from the Senate debate. And that's lesson 4. Mandates are very important. They should be respected and factored into policy development processes and legislative responses. Lesson number 5 is, in the relative irrelevance and obscurity of opposition, parties of conviction should never easily forego an opportunity to shape policy. The National Party obviously understands this. Its relationship with the Liberal Party is an uneasy one, but one which puts them in the policy game. The ministerial wing officers are more attractive than those of backbench opposition MPs as well. Labor could have achieved much more by leaving itself open to negotiation and policy amendments than it did by simply opposing the GST package. In failing to do so, it left the matter to the minor parties and the other Senate crossbenchers so few Australians voted for. The decision to quarantine defence from budget cuts was a significant Howard initiative and helped to consolidate the government's national security credentials, as did our historic intervention in East Timor. John Howard said he wanted Australians to be relaxed and comfortable, and while some of the more hardline policies at the time caused pain for many, most were relaxed and comfortable for most of his time in office, I would have to say. But like all governments, there were mistakes, scandals, resignations, and at times poor judgment. John Howard would be the first to concede that. In fact, he does so in Lazarus Rising. There, John Howard attributes Labor's 1983 election victory largely to Hawke's capacity to bring people together. Indeed, Hawke's campaign slogan was bringing Australians together. It was an interesting observation because John Howard didn't always follow that course of action himself. When he did, I would argue he did well. When he didn't, I would argue he did not do so well. But his longevity must tell us that he sought to unite more than he chose to divide. That's lesson number 6. The parties of protest succeed in the ugliness of division. Consensus building offers a more likely path to sustained success. It is also more likely to produce good policy outcomes. Now, John Howard was often slow to learn this lesson himself and revisited the strategy of division as late as 2006 and 2007 with his work choices legislation. It was an aggressive policy which in the end played a significant role in the demise of his government. In my view, industrial relations was John Howard's blind spot, as evidenced by the waterfront dispute of 1998 and indeed the Rio Tinto dispute in my own electorate during 98-99. The Rio Tinto dispute remains fresh in my mind. I vividly recall being thrown out of the House of Representatives chamber during question time following an angry intervention on the then Prime Minister who, whatever he believed to be the merits of his case, was revelling in the division of the dispute and was railing hard against the legitimate cause the union was pursuing on behalf of its members. And that brings me to lesson number 7. Politically motivated policy overreach too often ends in tears. Both major parties, of course, have failed to fully learn that lesson. Labor's overreach on climate change is but one recent example and one which continues to weigh on the Labor Party. There is much to suggest that John Howard was a stubborn person. It's almost a prerequisite for leadership. Often this is a strength and produces very good outcomes. On other occasions, it can be somewhat counterproductive. On issues, for example, like the apology to the stolen generation, in my view, John Howard's stubbornness came at great political cost and taints his legacy still. At the time, he argued that while we should acknowledge the wrongs of the past, the current generation of Australians should not be held responsible. I actually think that's wrong. To his credit in Lazarus Rising, Howard acknowledges some missteps on Indigenous policy. While I've no doubt he had a good appreciation of the extent of Indigenous disadvantage, I was never convinced, particularly given the tone of the debate during the WIC-induced amendments to the Native Title Act, that his approach was designed always to unify. I'm sure too that John Howard sought to divide, not unite, when devising his approach to refugee and national security policy. He was master of the political wedge and used it to great effect, often so successfully it weighs on Labor's vote to this day. That's lesson 8. Avoid a good political wedge at all costs, particularly when the issue is not necessarily fundamental to the most important issues facing Australian families or your natural support base. Adhering to long-held values and principles, of course, is admirable, but if doing so consigns you perpetually to the opposition benches, then it delivers little more than warm feelings and denies the opportunity to govern and to do many other good things. As Gough Whitlam once said, the impotent are pure. Along with his ability to read the mood of the electorate, agility and pragmatism were amongst John Howard's greatest strengths. He was no doubt assisted by the presence of National Party members in his cabinet and indeed in his party room, who would have kept him abreast of what people were thinking in the bush. By contrast, Labor's lack of sufficient regional representation in the parliamentary party is a barrier to policy and electoral success. We have some very good regional members, but not enough of them. Unsurprisingly, the term Howard Battlers appears in Lazarus Rising on more than one occasion. It was originally a term or a reference to the many traditional Labor voters, largely blue-collar voters, who deserted Labor and voted Liberal during the ill-fated 1996 by-election. I remember that well because I was sent there to door knock, and it wasn't one of my more pleasant experiences. They were waiting with baseball bats. These Howard Battlers became known as aspirational voters, those who work hard to deliver a better future for their families, those who want a tax system which incentivises and rewards work, those who want their government to focus on their personal and economic security, those who want less government in their lives, not more. Amongst the issues driving traditional Labor voters from Labor's arms still is environmental policy. This is not a new phenomenon. Indeed, it had its beginnings in the mid-1980s when Bob Hawke's Environment Minister Graham Richardson cleverly plugged votes leaking to the Green parties by developing Labor's own green agenda. Now, at the time, and for a long time after, this proved to be a great electoral positive for the Labor Party. But the hare Richardson set running, and which led to the timber truckies' blockade of Parliament House in 1995, John Howard couldn't believe his luck, ran right into Howard's political machine in 2004, when Labor's forestry policy debacle caused blue-collar unionists to cheer John Howard into a packed Launceston Albert Hall only days before polling day. Since then, the Labor Party has been struggling to successfully balance the aspiration of its traditional support base and its more recently arrived progressive base. It is a task made much harder by the 2010 deal Julia Gillard did with the Greens to form a minority government. Labor's 2019 equivocation over the Adani coal mine further compounded the problem, I have to say. Too many punters remember the 2010 signing ceremony, and they certainly remember Bob Brown's Stop Adani convoy too well. That's lesson 9. A political party that deserts its traditional base or is perceived to be deserting its base becomes an unelectable one. And I know that is a lesson John Howard refers to throughout the course of his book. It's a lesson Labor has been slow to learn. It's often said of Tony Abbott, and I quote, "You might not like him, but at least you know what he stands for," close quote. Being clear about what you stand for is possibly the most important building block to successful leadership. Possibly the most important building block. In fact, I would argue it is. The trick in politics is to be both liked, which is not always easy, and to be clear about what you stand for. It has to be said that John Howard managed to do that for most of his time as Australia's Prime Minister, and that's lesson number 10. Thank you very much.
Fitzgibbon, thank you very much for that. I can see some echoes of current issues in your list of 10. So there may be a message for others there as well. Look, our questions, if you don't mind taking questions, we've got a few that jump around a bit. So let me put a couple to you. The first one is about the Labor Party appealing to country voters, and you may have heard Professor Boltrell prior to you talking, discussing the notion of country-mindedness and the importance that the country has for Australia's sense of identity, and the importance that farming has in our sense of self. I note that I think the experiment was in New South Wales, that there was a country Labor party. I must confess I don't know what's become of that, whether it's still in existence. But is there some way of trying to focus Labor a little bit more on those sorts of constituencies?
Well, Linda is absolutely right. There is an opportunity there, and some of those joining us might know that I formed a thing called the Country Caucus within the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party immediately after the 2013 election. And that was designed in part to attempt to get the Parliamentary Party more focused on issues in regional Australia, to have more discussion specifically through the policy lens, but on regional Australia. And I used to joke to allow regional members to hunt as a pack, use our collective weight to get things done in the caucus which are favourable to regional Australia. Country Labor existed a long time before that. It was a separate branch of the New South Wales Labor Party, formerly a separate branch registered with the Australian Electoral Commission. It lived for a long time, but ran into trouble through the reforms of the party after more recent problems, and has now ceased to exist. But what it did was allow Labor candidates, mainly state candidates, to brand themselves differently in the regions rather than Labor Party on their how to votes or posters, etc. They had Country Labor. I think it had mixed success. I think it left, on the downside, I think it left some voters confused about who these people were. They didn't always understand what Country Labor was. So I wasn't a big fan. The best way to get results for the party in regional Australia is to have more regional people sitting around the decision-making table. But of course, to do that, you need to win more regional seats, and certainly to be successful in the future, the Labor Party needs to win more regional seats.
Joel, do you get the sense that country people don't quite understand Labor, that Labor ought to be a party that appeals to them, that's a reasonable home for them, but you're either not selling the message or there's some misunderstanding between two sides?
It's an interesting consideration, because Labor was in large part born in the bush, out of the shearing sheds of regional Queensland. And the unions which affiliate with the Labor Party, in very large part, have a membership in rural and regional Australia. Australian Workers Union, the Mining and Energy Division of the CFMEU, for example, past tense now after a certain vote at a conference yesterday. So you know, we are a party of the bush, and there's a thing called the McKell model in the Labor Party, which is a reference back to the former Governor-General, but before that, leader of the Labor Party in New South Wales and Premier, who specifically focused on the bush in his attempt to win government, as did Neville Rand, by the way, in 76 and 77. So there are important lessons to be learned there for the modern Labor Party. But you can't just talk about the bush. You've got to talk the talk as well, and deliver for the bush. And one of the Labor Party's problems is that its parliamentary caucus is obviously dominated by city-dwelling MPs. And, you know, the regional MPs don't have the weight I would like to see them have. And again, the only way you fix that is to win more regional seats. So it's sort of chicken and the egg, isn't it?
Yes. Look, the other point of connection, perhaps, and one that the National Party sometimes claims for itself, is the notion that they represent the poorest components of Australian society. Now, I have a feeling that the analysis that I've seen is that the three poorest electorates in Australia are held by Labor at present, and as distinct from Barnaby Joyce's claims that they hold the poorest seats in Australia. But actually, I understand that on average, the average National Party electorate is poorer than the average city, other country electorate. So there's a sense in which the National Party in some ways sees itself as the defender of the poor. And again, that's a type of natural fit for the Labor Party, would it not be?
Yeah, it's a reminder that the political spectrum is not a straight line. It's almost circular.
Yeah.
And Barnaby Joyce was right at some point. When I last researched this, right back in 2013, the National Party held 9 of the 10 poorest electorates in the country. And of course, the irony of that is that they keep voting for them. That's the point I was making now. Now some might say, well, Labor's got a few poor electorates too, and they keep voting for the Labor Party. But much to my chagrin, the Labor Party has only won a majority in the House of Representatives once in the last 27 years. So our less than adequate response to that is, well, give us more time in government and, we might do even more for working class people. Certainly that remains the foundation of our existence, equality of opportunity, a hand up for people who need it, and giving aspirational people every opportunity to succeed in life.
Look, our next question is really about the polls. You spoke about the polls, the news polls, and others that had Mark Latham ahead for a large part of the campaign, and other polls as well that didn't turn out to be particularly valuable for Labor. The question is really, what do they tell you? How should you respond to polling?
Oh, this is one of the great dilemmas of democracy. Do you follow what the people want, or do you lead by example and take them with you? Obviously, the answer to that is a bit of both. And, there is a compromise, I suppose, on that front. You can be as bold and brave and courageous as possibly can be on the policy front. But if you lose every election, then there's not much point. This is, for example, what I always say of Labor's climate change policy. When you overreach, when it's too ambitious, you might be able to boast that you have the best policy in the world, but it's not much good if it stays in the top drawer after every election you achieve nil. So opinion polls are to be watched and taken note of, particularly the private polling that happens throughout the course of an election campaign, the nightly tracking, for example. But it's also wrong to be absolutely guided by opinion polls. I mean, if John Howard had been guided by opinion polls, he wouldn't have gone into the 1998 election promising to introduce a 10% GST.
One of the points you made strongly, I think, was that the National Party gets away with a lot in terms of saying one thing in the electorate and then joining a coalition and doing something else. I wanted to press you about the diversity of view within the Labor Party itself. Let's say that the Liberal National Coalition works rather well as a broad church, or even as an ecumenical council, perhaps, because we've got a couple of churches in there. But how about the Labor Party? Would a broader, a more welcoming approach to diversity of ideas be useful for the Labor Party?
I've often been critical of the Labor Party's level of discipline. I would certainly argue that the Labor Party in Australia has the highest level of discipline in the world, not just in Australia, but in the world. I'd also argue the Liberal Party in Australia has the second highest level of discipline in the world. You watch what happens in the Congress or in the Commons in the UK and in many other places. You'll often see members of the Labor Party, the Republicans, the Democrats, etc., voting contrary to the bloc situation of their party, or certainly speaking out about it. But in the Labor Party, we've fallen into this trap. To an extent, the Liberals have too. The National Party MPs have a little bit more flexibility, but don't kid yourself. When they cross the floor, it's a very big issue, and I think it's counterproductive for the Labor Party to be expecting its candidate in Flynn in central Queensland, or even in the Hunter Valley, to be mimicking the words of what the leader, for example, might be saying in Surrey Hills or Richmond in Melbourne. This doesn't add up. It's not possible. you have to allow your candidate in Flynn or Capricornia or Herbert in Queensland to reflect the views and aspirations of their local people. You can't expect that person, he or she, to be just mimicking the words of the Canberra bubble. So the Labor Party has to have a hard look at that, in my view. But again, it's not a problem just for us. It's an increasing problem for the Liberal Party, which is, the Labor Party now has two bases, the original working class base and the more recently arrived progressive base. But the Liberal Party is a bit like that too. You see a lot of division, the difference between Craig Kelly and, Trent Zimmerman in North Sydney is enormous. So this is a management issue for them. I think it'll get harder, and I think the major parties will have to find ways of relaxing the discipline on its members.
Well, Joel Fitzgibbon, thank you so much for that. Your 10 lessons from the Howard years are very interesting, and you remind us again, which we often forget, that the wins of the Howard government were sometimes much closer than we, in a hazy memory, recall. So look, it's been a delight to have you with us, and good luck in your future endeavours.
A great pleasure, and I really thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful to see you.